Well, hello there, you amazing, beautiful, wonderful people. It's Tuesday, baby. It's Tuesday, terrific Tuesday. You're looking absolutely terrific as well, I must add. We're going to get straight into the meat and potatoes, as this is video 1 of 3. That's it, baby, 1 of 3. Better than Domino's. They do 2 for Tuesday. We do 3 for Tuesday. If that's not worth a like and subscribe, I do not know what is. Look, if I'm better than sloppy bloody pizza, look, get subscribed. Be a hero. Anyway, first of all, before we get into the meat and potatoes of a new DNA specialist coming into the midst of the Idaho 4 case, we've just got to talk about a little bit of other insanity happening in Idaho, which again proves to us that this is not somewhere that we should be living, because it's nuts. This here, some children have gone missing. Some children have gone missing in Idaho. So check this out, right? So mother fears missing Idaho teens taken by FLDS amidst disturbing revelations. And this is a 13 to 15-year-old Alan Fisher and Rachel Fisher. And it says the Jefferson County, Idaho, an Idaho mother is desperately searching for her 2 missing teenage children, fearing they may have been abducted by members of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. Elizabeth Roundy of Mount View, Jefferson County, reported her 13-year-old son, Alan LeGrand Fisher, and 15-year-old daughter, Rachel Shelley LeRae Fisher, missing on June 22nd. The children were last seen wearing traditional FLDS attire. Rachel was in a dark green prairie dress with braided hair, and Alan was wearing a light blue shirt and blue jeans and black slip-on shoes similar to Crocs. Roundy believes her children were traveling in a grey Honda sedan en route to her sister's home in Mendon, Utah, approximately 10 miles outside of Logan. Authorities have issued an Amber Alert for the missing children, instructing anyone who spots them or the suspected vehicle contact the Jefferson CSO at that number on the screen. Roundy, a former FLDS member, reportedly told law enforcement she believes her children were taken in response to recent alarming statements made by imprisoned FLDS leader Warren Jeffs. Jeffs, who is serving a life sentence in Texas for a load of nasty shit, has reportedly claimed recent revelations directing that FLDS children must die to be resurrected as pure beings. Holding Out Help, a Utah-based non-profit helping people escape polygamous background, says that Jeffs and other FLDS church leaders have instructed followers to retrieve their children by any means necessary and prepare them for an impending end of times. FLDS children are reportedly intended to gather to assist in building Zion, where they will then die and become pure and translated beings. There are some revelations out there that are rarely concerning from the FLDS church that talk about becoming translated beings, but they must die first. Tonya Toole, executive director of Holding Out Help, told Local News 8, and they'll be risen like Jesus Christ in 2.5 to 3 days. It's a 5-year revelation. We're 3 years into it, and so I think she's, Roundy, worried that her kid's life may be taken at the end of the day. FLDS members reportedly believe the current church leadership is leading faithful followers to the same fate as those who died in historical tragedies like Jonestown and Waco. And look, apparently these as well, their sister's been missing already for like a few years. So just another story that proves that, and this, it ain't just here, but it's like when you hear about Idaho, it's like, well, nothing ever happens here. Nothing ever happens. We can't understand it. It's a wonderful, beautiful place. And when there's crime like this happens, and if you look over on Lucy Morningstar's post, I'll tell you why they don't think anything happens, because they don't fucking report it. They release statistics where things like the Idaho 4 are omitted from it, so you don't know that it's happened. I don't know how shit like that can fly under the radar. I do not know. But there we go. But this is what we're talking about. in this video here. So a forensic scientist has weighed in on Kohberger DNA evidence. We're going to talk about this in a second with respect of the DNA and just put some shit to bed. Not shit the bed, shit to bed. Boise, Idaho, a key piece of evidence is becoming a point of contention in the it became a bone of contention right back at the start. Right back at the start. It's not becoming. So in the University of Idaho quadruple murder case, the podcast Criminally Obsessed interviewed Joseph Scott Morgan, a forensic scientist and distinguished scholar at Jacksonville State University. They shared that interview with us. A sample of DNA was found on a knife sheath at the scene of the crime that came back as a match for Brian Kohberger. The investigators used a third-party private database to match the DNA using forensic genetic genealogy. While the DNA is not being disputed, which is something that the guilters keep coming on about. Let me just come up here and talk about this for a second, right? Ann Taylor is not going to dispute it. Why would she dispute it? The defense are there to defend their client, but if they get into these backwards and forwards arguments and try and argue and say, well, his DNA weren't there, then it just becomes a mess, and the jury are just going to be looking at, well, the prosecution is saying that his DNA was there. She's trying to say that it weren't there. The best thing to do is just to say, all right, then his DNA's there. Now let's see how it fucking got there, and that could be how it physically got there. And it's not all, when we talk about planting, we don't necessarily mean that the DNA was planted on the knife sheath at the scene of the crime. That's what some people are too fucking stupid to understand. When you talk about planting, that can literally just be that it was put into the case somewhere along the line. Not that necessarily that they got it and put it on the sheath at the scene of the crime. Which we're saying that they are saying that that's how they found Brian Kohberger, how they got a match, that his DNA was on the knife sheath. But her saying that, okay, we'll accept that, she's not necessarily accepting that that his actual DNA was actually found on an actual knife sheath at the scene of the crime. What she's accepting is that the prosecution are saying that his DNA was there in the results that they've come up with. So she's going to say, all right, his DNA was there then. So how the fuck did that happen then? Because if she's going to come along and say, well, he weren't there, you can't prove he was there. So, and we can potentially say that he was likely not there, because those of you who continuously, and when you know who you are. When I say this, the people who will continuously attack the likes of Cy Ray and say, yeah, but the judge said that he was a conspiracy theorist. Well, of course he did, because that was the quickest way to just nip that in the bud and not really have to deal with it and challenge it, just to say it's a conspiracy theory. But I know that Hitler didn't allow Cy Ray, even though he knew he was available, to argue his point or to have a further discussion about it. It was just, no, you're a conspiracy theorist. We don't need to speak about this anymore. It's done. No, it fucking absolutely needs to be spoken about. Absolutely needs to be spoken about, because the prosecution are claiming something and simultaneously seemingly hiding information that is exculpatory to Brian Kohberger in phone data, in time advance reports that they absolutely could have got, likely did get, but claim that they don't exist, which is bullshit. It's absolute bullshit that they didn't fucking exist. And you can just do your own research and find that statement was rubbish. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a second. Let's just come back here, right? So while the DNA is not being disputed, the question becomes why Kohberger's DNA was at the scene. And that's like what I just said. Why was it there then? Why was his DNA there? And it doesn't necessarily mean why was it there at the scene. Why is it here altogether and being claimed to have been at the scene? Morgan says the prosecution needs to explain the process of genetic genealogy. Now, the one thing that I will say is, from what we can see, it doesn't look like they're going to even bring this up. This isn't going to be discussed. The IgG situation and this tip, it looks like that both the prosecution and the defense have had to have a discussion about how they're going to address this while not talking about the IgG process, because they feel that that's going to be problematic. I can't get my head around that for a start, but it is what it is. We'll see what happens. In a way that makes sense to the jury, needs to explain the process. What they mean is not necessarily the process of genetic genealogy, but they're going to have to explain how they got to where they are without mentioning the things that likely went against the rights of every single American citizen. We'll ignore that. If they can sell it to the jury and explain the process and how it works with forensic genetic genealogy, the jury, I think, in my opinion, will have a really hard time getting past the odds that it could be anyone other than Brian Kohberger, which I fucking agree with. I absolutely agree, and that's why it's there. That's exactly why it's there, because DNA is so fucking difficult to overcome. But what we see in multiple cases over the years is DNA is generally the reason, the protagonist for people being wrongfully convicted. But in a lot of cases, you will find that it's because they ignored other DNA at the scene, and it turns out that it was in fact the other DNA that was the killer or the attacker. Do you know what I mean? And this seems to be heading in that exact same direction, where you've got some DNA, Brian Kohberger's, that everyone wants to leap on and hump like a randy dog, while simultaneously wanting to ignore the fact that there's multiple other DNA sources, including that of four brothers, which was brought up by one of the laboratories looking at it, which, again, Heather looks at in this document here, which, again, she's trying to address how she can speak about it without speaking about it. You know, I can probably not name the four brothers that the state lab tested. The court, okay, can we avoid talking about the fact of the four brothers? I understand it's there, but I'm not gathering the import of it on the issues at hand. I think you could reference that there was some information that was itself insufficient to generate a profile, and I know what you're talking about. And it's like you've got to dance and skip around things. And it says, look, I think I can talk about Othram's recommendations that were attempted to be followed, but nothing worked. I think I can do that. And it's like you've got to kind of try and jump through hoops with this DNA. That's why it's such a mess. But anyway, so we go on here, right? So the type of DNA found is as touch DNA. It can be left behind by something as small as a skin cell making contact with the surface. Morgan says that this is usually just a fraction of a DNA molecule, but when tested with a fuel sample can yield a match. There is always in a molecular space some place to be caught because you can't plan for everything, said Morgan. The defense has raised questions concerning the DNA and the use of a private database outside of what is normally used by law enforcement, saying it is an infringement on Kohberger's privacy. Morgan believes this will be a point of discussion when the trial begins. Again, I don't know how much of this is going to be discussed, because we have been led to believe that a lot of this is going to be omitted from the court. We will have to see what they actually discuss and how they discuss it. But I genuinely hope that the DNA situation is spoken about in a way that is right. Who knows? Since the defense is disputing the validity of the science behind the match in DNA, Morgan said one of the most effective ways to win against DNA is to call into question how the DNA was collected and handled. The problem with DNA, though, is that the numbers are so astronomical, you have to look for human error, he said. Brian Kohberger was accused of stabbing four University of Idaho students, Madison Mogan, Katie Gonsalves, Anna Knodel, and Ethan Chambers. He's pleaded not guilty. The trial is set to begin in August the 11th. So yeah, look, with respect of this DNA, I get it. If you're a guilt, or if you're someone who believes that Brian Kohberger is guilty, then this DNA, this knife sheath, is going to be your linchpin, and the fact that the defence are not seemingly challenging that it's there, again, it's almost like that's another feather in your cap. But it isn't as simple as that. It isn't as simple as that whatsoever. And you only have to look back at different cases that have been dealt with by the Innocence Project to learn that this isn't quite as clear cut as you may imagine. And we have to be so fucking careful with it. At the end of the day, if you look at every single piece of evidence that's against Brian Kohberger and take it on its own merit, I've said this multiple times, there are problems with each of it. Yes, if you step back and say, yeah, but there was a knife sheath found there, he purchased this knife sheath, we don't know that. You don't know that it was this knife sheath. You don't know if he still got it. You don't know if this knife sheath that was found was in fact the sheath that went with the murder weapon itself. We've been conditioned to believe certain things about this crime, but how many times do you get into a trial setting and learn that the things that you felt were true or thought were true before the trial, you were so wrong that it's shocking and surprising to you? And that could be the case here. And it seems to me that the case against Brian Kohberger, there are so many, again, as aforementioned, there's so many issues surrounding each individual component that a lot of this is going to depend upon the sales tactic within the trial and how people going into that trial, their preconceived notions of what to expect and what they are likely hearing. And it does seem that the prosecution are hoping to ride this wave of negativity that has been sparked by the likes of the recent Dateline, this documentary that come out, and there is another upcoming one. There's going to be like the second surge, and this is going to run a 4-part docuseries, and it's going to. And that's why I feel that in this instance that there should be a delay in the trial, but I don't think we're going to get one. Let me know down below if you think there is going to be a delay. I don't think so. We should hear any time. Maybe we'll hear today what's going on. Maybe Judge Hitler will remove the death penalty in order to satisfy Ann Taylor, saying that, look, if you remove the death penalty, then we're ready. If you don't, we're not. That's on the record. So there is going to be problems down the line if there is no removal of the death penalty and no continuance granted. It is going to come back and bite Hitler 100% because it's been put in the record by the defense team that they're just not ready. And that's not Brian Kohberger's fault. You know, why should he be sentenced to death when the court already know that his team are not ready for trial and they've voiced that? Look, it is what it is. But you'll have to let me know. This DNA situation, another specialist coming forward and saying that this is problematic. Yes, it's problematic, but who knows? Do you know what I mean? I don't think that just because they are saying that Brian Kohberger's DNA was there, that is a done deal. There is other DNA around the scene. There are multiple other DNA samples around the scene. What about them? Why are they not as important as the one that they're claiming was Brian Kohberger's? Let me know down below. I'll catch you all in the next one. Mwah.